Still, the biggest fundamental problem for the government going into the next election and for Julia Gillard was the promise made before the last election, and it does raise this whole question of what is a lie, what is a broken promise, is there a difference, and how lethal can these declarations be? First, a bit of history.
By 1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty.
These tax cuts will be delivered in full this financial year. They will be LAW law.
There's no way that GST will ever be part of our policy.
Never, ever.
Never, ever. It's dead. It was killed by the voters in the last election.
The greatest moral and economic challenge we will face in the 21st century is climate change.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
George, take your pick from that lot. Which one was the most lethal?
What a fantastic little collection that is, because it actually reminds you of how much the media has changed in the last 15 to 20 years. Bob Hawke was a figure of fun for saying no child will live in poverty. He meant to say need. He dropped the line out of the speech.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. And Labor did win the 1990 election subsequent to that non-promise being made in 1987.
Yeah.
Paul Keating's LAW, well, that was lethal. That was lethal after the election. But I'll tell you, having covered that 93 election campaign, I remembered the quote, but I don't remember it being an issue at the time. It became an issue after the election when they had that horror budget, John Dawkins horror budget, and they had to roll back those tax cuts. That certainly contributed to Paul Keating's demise as Prime Minister. So Hawke didn't bother him so much, Keating it did. John Howard and the GST is an interesting one. If he'd gone to the 96 election with the GST, he might have won that election, but he wouldn't have won a landslide, and he might have been a once-up. He was able to, basically walk his way around that one by saying, well, I've changed my mind, I'm going to take it back to the people.
And when he changed his mind, he took it to the people.
Took it to the people.
Yeah,
he fought an election on it.
And that is the fundamentally decent thing to do. Now, I'll just take you back a step. Keating didn't dishonour the LAW tax cuts, he reconfigured them. He brought the first half forward and then turned the second half into super. It was actually John Howard who dishonoured the LAW tax cuts because he agreed to match the money in super and then walked away from that. The other thing that's changed, of course, is it's the repetition of this quote. LAW hurt Keating because you kept hearing it after the election.
Well, I think we've heard the
carbon tax
Julia Gillard
Now we're in the digital age, and that's all you hear. And of course, I defy anyone to remember that to be an election-deciding promise made before campaign day. She said it, okay, she said it once.
But then it comes down to what is a lie and what is a broken promise. If she said that at the time, based on her understanding, or at least hope, that there would be majority government, then she's left with a minority government.
Yeah, well, two things.
But all bets off,
yeah,
and
all bets are off.
Therefore, that's not a lie.
Well, it's definitely
not
a
broken promise.
It's never been a lie. I mean, terrific messaging from the opposition to turn this into the greatest lie ever told in Australian history. We'll leave Iraq and Vietnam to one side. This is apparently the greatest lie a leader has ever told. She was ruling out a carbon tax. Now, a carbon tax, as it was understood at the time, was just a tax not as a fixed price leading to emissions trading scheme, but just a straight tax, which is essentially the Jeff Carmody model from formerly of Access Economics. Now, Tony Abbott actually briefly supported that particular policy, so she's ruled that out. It turns out, and I've spoken to enough people about this after the election, they weren't clear in that office what she was ruling in or ruling out. They didn't actually understand the full mechanism of the ETS. One of the reasons why Labor is in this mess today is that neither Julia Gillard nor Wayne Swan, when Kevin Rudd was trying to push this thing through and then he did his backflip, we'll talk about greatest moral challenge in a sec, is that neither Rudd nor Swan were actively engaged on this issue. They may beg to differ, but I can tell you for a fact that Kevin Rudd and Penny Wong and Lindsay Tanner understood this thing. Swan and Gillard had their mind elsewhere, and they're still paying for it today.
It just simply wasn't an issue in the 2010 election.
Can you
campaign.
recall us saying that during the election campaign?
No, and I followed I covered the campaign for the blog that I was doing at the time. I don't particularly remember that. All I remember about their environmental policy, full stop, was this vague and very silly idea of a people's assembly and reaching a consensus.
That got a lot of attention.
Was the killer in that
and so many people
campaign.
actually say, but I voted for Julia Gillard on that basis.
Well, yeah, there might be a bit of revisionism there. Yeah.
But nevertheless, she has provided the opposition with an absolutely perfect piece of ammunition. It could not be more graphic.
True.
And now in their ads, of course, the Brisbane River has disappeared. Have you noticed? She's sort of standing there against this sort of grey background as if it's sort of an evening presentation. They've made it look incredibly formal. It's very, very clever, and it is very damaging.
The nation.
Yeah.
Although one thing here, though, sorry to cut you off. If an electorate's predisposed not to trust or not to like or to be let down by a leader, things like this will echo.
Yep.
In Bob Hawke's case, you'd think, well, we'll give him another term. I'll give him a pass on this particular
Do you think the
issue.
Kevin Rudd thing belonged in that list? It was a different kind of context.
I think we're so used to hearing so much meaningless kind of blather from our politicians. They spend so much time saying very, very little and making very, very little in terms of hard or specific commitments or definitive statements. So when we get a definitive statement, when we get something that actually means something that we can grab onto, we remember it and we kind of punish them for it afterwards.
When they walk away, yeah. Look, I
And we
think
were meant to remember it.
Yeah.
I mean,
he definitely wanted you to remember it. And in fact, the mess that Labor are in at the moment begins with the Kevin Rudd walking away from the greatest moral challenge of our time. Not pulling the trigger for the double dissolution at the beginning of 2010 when the option was there. Tony Abbott to this day still counts his blessings that Kevin Rudd blinked.